Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you might be. My name is Kevin Michael Grace, and this is the KMG show for Friday, February the 26th, 2021. I'm going to begin today by talking about the military. What is the purpose of the military? Well, as far as my own country, Canada, goes, I'm really quite at a loss to explain that. It seems to me that Canada's force, the Canadian forces, as they're called, once again, not Canadian armed forces, because that might seem a little too aggressive. It's about 6.3%, depending on the year, depending on how you calculate the budget, maybe over the last 10 years, averaging about 7% of Canada's budget. Currently around $22 billion a year. Of course, that will be completely thrown out of whack when the figures for 2020 come in, because Canadian government is spent, $200 billion on COVID, with more to come. But nevertheless, the military is a significant expenditure in my country. And as far as I can see now, it serves only as a social laboratory and a pipeline for sexual harassment complaints, sexual inequity lawsuits, PTSD lawsuits. That's about it. And perhaps as a result of this, it's melting down. It's coming apart. Because of scandals, sexual scandals. And all of this was predicted, including by me, back in the early 1990s, that the integration of women into the Canadian military would lead to, well, if not disaster, let's just say some bad things. For instance, rules against fraternization can be thrown out the window, and they obviously have been thrown out the window. That if you're going to put men and women together under circumstances such as the military, they're going to be having sex with each other. And women are going to seek male protectors in the military, and they are going to be promoted as a result. But as we have seen, when your mentor reaches the big position and decides, well, this is breaking the rules, so I'm going to have to break it off with you, then things get ugly. Here's a story from Amanda Connolly, of Global News. Conservatives urge salary freeze, independent probe over military misconduct claims. Conservative leader Erin O'Toole says there should be a freeze on promotions and salary increases for senior leaders in the Canadian military until an independent investigation can probe the Canadian Force's handling of the long-standing problem of sexual misconduct within its ranks. Yes, this long-standing problem that the Canadian military deliberately invited, or rather the Canadian government invited. In a press conference with journalists on Friday, O'Toole said recent twin military police investigations into both the current and former chiefs of defense staff show an independent probe is needed to assess where the military is falling short and how it can change its culture. Where the military is falling short in protecting Canada from foreign enemies. Well, after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the only conceivable foreign military threat to Canada comes from the United States. It's that simple. And in my entire lifetime, I have never seen any discussion of what the purpose of the Canadian military is supposed to be. Apparently, it's all about culture now. O'Toole said, when there is a problem at the top of an organization, it is reasonable to suggest there is a problem throughout. This is a pressing issue that cannot wait to be fixed. Admiral Art MacDonald stepped aside from his role of Chief of Defense Staff late Wednesday night after military police opened an investigation into him on unspecified concerns. MacDonald had only been on the job for a matter of weeks after taking over from General Jonathan Vance, who retired from the top role in January. Global News reported February 2nd that Vance is facing allegations of inappropriate behavior from two female subordinates. He denies all such allegations. Well, as we know from the woman who went public with allegations against Jonathan Vance, she was a woman who had a consensual relationship with him, sexual relationship, for quite a few years, and she became a spurned woman. She continued to be promoted, by the way. O'Toole, a former cabinet minister in the Conservative government that appointed Vance, did not answer questions on whether he had ever heard of any allegations or concerns about Vance prior to the event. This independent investigation is shaping up to be unprecedented in scope, with growing concerns that only a large human resources firm, that's what the military needs, more HR, or an official like a former Supreme Court justice could do the job. Just for foreign listeners, viewers, in my country, Supreme Court justices are as gods. Conservative defense critic James Bazan told Global News Thursday that he would support a public inquiry into the military's handling of sexual misconduct in its ranks, which were identified by former Supreme Court Justice Marie Deschamps as endemic in her landmark 2015 report. Okay. So here's a story from Canadian News. The fact that Admiral Art MacDonald stepped aside as Canada's defense chief while misconduct allegations are investigated demonstrates how seriously such cases are taken, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says. But Trudeau said Friday that more must be done to ensure workplaces are free of harassment and intimidation. He said that this is something that is extremely important, and it's something we've taken strides on, both in our government and in the military, but there's always more to do, because there is an ongoing review into this situation, and we're ensuring that all the steps are properly taken. I won't be commenting specifically on this process at the time. Here's another story on this issue, the issue of the Canadian military, from Matt Gurney in the National Post yesterday. Just build the damn ships and build the damn planes. The cost overruns are the price to pay for our incompetence. The world is evolving in dangerous ways that Canada's abysmal military procurement system simply can't keep up with. Decades ago, when I was in talk radio, the big story was, in the late 80s, that Canada was going to build nuclear-powered submarines. And this was going to assert our sovereignty in the Arctic. Well, it turns out that nuclear-powered submarines are quite expensive, and so Canada bought some used diesel submarines instead, and they can't keep them in the water. In fact, almost 20 years ago, a professor who studies military matters at the University of Calgary told me that Canada's entire weapon system, all of them, were either obsolete or on the verge of being obsolete, and if Canada did not invest significantly, heavily in these weapon systems, they would never be able to, because the cost would be too onerous. And the Canadian governments, going back to Brian Mulroney, have made all these promises. Oh, yes, we're going to make the Canadian military proud again, and we're going to spend all this money, and they don't. For the reason that, I suppose, before COVID-19, they couldn't spend the money. They wouldn't be able to find the money without cutting program spending elsewhere. Now, I suppose, they could simply lard it on top of the stupendous COVID-19 debt, but people would ask the question, why are you spending billions and billions on instruments of death when you should be spending it on life instead? The Canadian media doesn't spend very much time looking at the disastrous shape of our military. because it would be too embarrassing, simply too embarrassing. But again, the underlying question is, why should we buy these weapons systems? What would be the purpose? And I've yet to see any answer for this. But wait, there are systemic problems. Ooh. Yes, this is a piece from Policy Options, which comes from a quasi-official journalistic, governmental journalistic source. Only a fundamental culture change, there's that word culture again, will address military sexual misconduct. And this piece is by Maya Eichler, who holds the Canada Research Chair in Social Innovation and Community Engagement and is an associate professor of political studies and women's studies at Mount St. Vincent University. And I'm looking at this woman's face and I'm thinking that her resting bitch face could blow tanks up from 1,000 yards or conceivably even shoot down planes. And the other co-author is Marie-Claude Gagnon, who served for 7 years in the Canadian Forces and is the founder and leader of the online support network. It's Just 700, a Canadian group of military sexual trauma survivors. The duo writes, all political parties should share an interest in wanting to ensure the health and well-being of military members through a safe workplace. Yes, because the military has always been understood as a safe workplace. The committee needs to use its powers to help install the two missing levers needed to address sexual misconduct in the forces, a strategy to bring about military culture change, and an oversight mechanism to ensure the required changes actually occur. The Canadian military needs a comprehensive strategy that acknowledges its institutional role and responsibility in preventing sexual misconduct, along with all other forms of discrimination and violence in the workplace. Given the ongoing systemic resistance to military, here we go again, culture change, long-term independent external oversight is required to ensure the health and well-being of all women and men serving in the Canadian military. You didn't see what they did there? They put women ahead of men because it's obviously women who are the leaders in the Canadian military, de facto, if not de jure. Okay. Oh, Operation Honor, which was a 2015 investigation by many, including by me. But root causes, environment. The military is a workplace, not unlike the RCMP, that is designed around an unstated but institutionally assumed white, heterosexual, male norm. Boo! This norm was perpetuated by a long history of legally sanctioned sex and gender discrimination. The legal discriminations have been removed, but the culture, dread word, hasn't changed. Those labeled as other for not fitting into the preconceived norm of what a Canadian soldier should be are too often still treated as second-class soldiers. Oh, so do we want 4.5 feet tall women weighing 80 pounds in the military? Are we not taking advantage of their skills? So you can see where this is going. And I don't think, when it happens, don't say that, I was a prophet, because it's so blindingly obvious. The military is going to be reconstructed so that it is a big, gay, female, BIPOC army. It won't be big, and it won't be useful at warfare, but it will be gay, female, and BIPOC, because that's what really matters. Let's go to the chat. Hello to Palcasso 88. Dan says we have a military in Canada. There's an army barracks just a few blocks away from an armory, just a few blocks away from where I am. Metal Mike says, what possible hope do we have as Canadians to reverse course on China when a power corp bankrolls the politicians who sell out our country to China. Well, yeah. Canada is making noise about the two Mikes who have been imprisoned in China for quite some time. This has to do with the Huawei corruption case. Meanwhile, the Canadian government announces that it is bankrolling Huawei to do research with Canadian companies on high tech. That's really sending a message. Zedric the Heretic says, hello, Kevin. Australian military is not as bad yet, but on its way. Turkey Who says the West is being destroyed from within. Let it happen. One reason Australian military hasn't gone full pause yet is geography vis-a-vis Canada, says Zedric. Steve says, I read an opinion that the Canadian military doesn't have the combat power to suppress a 2,000-man insurgency. This was from a Canadian official. Well, I wouldn't be surprised. I joked last year that 200 men with 22s could probably take Ottawa. It's a blessing in disguise, says Head McNeck. The more weapons your military has, the more likely they are to go on stupid adventures. Well, Canada spent about a decade in Afghanistan for God knows what reason. And for quite some years now, Canadian soldiers have had to hitch rides on American transport planes because we don't have them. So the lack of equipment doesn't preclude Canada getting involved in stupid military adventures. We are now in the West African country of Malawi on a peacekeeping mission. Why? Not really been explained. Little Mike says the advantage of a gay female-dominated army is that we can send them to Afghanistan and win that war once and for all. Well, that sounds like a joke, but one of the primary reasons put forward by the Stephen Harper Conservative government for Canada's long military involvement in Afghanistan was because of feminism, because there was sexual discrimination against women in Afghanistan. And apparently things need to be blown up and Canadian soldiers need to die because of that. Let's move on to America, which has a similar problem. There was a piece that came out 4 weeks ago at Revolver News called America's Military is the Best in the World, but Not for Long. It begins, conservatives and patriots understandably have great affinity for the United States military. It has historically won great victories that have advanced both liberty abroad and protected it at home. For close to 80 years, it has been beyond question the most advanced and powerful fighting force on planet Earth. Relative to its potential adversaries, the American armed forces of the past few decades could arguably be the most powerful military that has ever existed in any country at any time in world history. Most conservatives also instinctively and understandably see the military as a reservoir of traditional and conservative values. Sometimes when conservatives darkly contemplate the possibility that left-wing extremists may try to overthrow the rights of Americans, they console themselves with the thought that the invincible U.S. military will be on our side. It is increasingly obvious that these thoughts are mistaken. First, it's clear that thanks to political purges and the persistent progressive colonization of all American institutions, the military is no longer a conservative institution in any meaningful sense. But there is more basic shortcoming in play. America's armed forces are in steep decline. It may still be the world's strongest military, but its advantage is shrinking every day. This is not a comprehensive assessment of a hypothetical war with China or any other country. Rather, it's just a collection of red flags and warning signs that all is not well with the military of the world's waning superpower. To wit, soldiers are getting fat. A viral image briefly made the rounds after the National Guard was deployed to guard the Capitol. More than any 1,000-word essay could, the photo illustrates the worrisome preparedness of some of America's armed forces. And there is a woman eating, and she appears to be, 60, 80 pounds overweight? That would be my guess. A Revolver comments, not very intimidating. How much would you trust this woman to capture a defended position in urban warfare? Well, There's another photo that I saw that a lot of people saw, and it was of black cadets graduating from West Point. I don't know, there was about 50, 60 of them, and at least half of them were obviously significantly overweight. And these are West Point grads. So what? They're in their early 20s. The woman above at least has the defense of being in the National Guard, but even America's active duty servicemen are getting chunky. Between 2001 and 2016, the military's overweight percentage quintupled. About 7.8% of the military, roughly 1 in every 13 troops, is clinically overweight, defined by a body mass index greater than 25. This rate has crept upwards since 2001, when it was just 1.6%, or 1 in 60, and its highest among women, blacks, Hispanics, and older service members. More than 17% of military personnel were considered obese across DoD, up from less than 16% 4 years earlier. For the Navy, the rate was 22% compared to 8.3% of Marines. The Army's rate matched the overall average, and the Air Force was slightly higher at about 18%. Having an army of fat soldiers is a gigantic red flag. It's a sign of a military that has grown soft, that is slacking on keeping its members at the peak of mental and physical readiness to protect the country. If the military is letting its physical expectations for soldiers slide, what other less visible things is it letting go to seed? The Obama administration removed the ban on women in combat forces in 2013, and for the past 7 years, the U.S. Armed Forces has been gradually incorporating them into more and more important roles. The first women graduated from Army Ranger School in 2015. In 2016, women became eligible for the Special Forces, and 2020 saw the first woman Green Beret. I'll just break in to say that this is particularly important because we've seen in recent years that the U.S. military has been depending less and less on the infantry and more on special units, elite units, in order to fight its wars. And now these elite units are being infected with the same pause that has infected the infantry and the Navy. So Revolver asks, are there women capable of being effective combat soldiers? Are some women more fit for combat than some men? Sure, but every clear-thinking person knows the truth as well. Mass incorporation of women into the military is bad for morale and bad for unit effectiveness, and inevitably leads to the lowering of standards. A 2015 Marine Corps study was clear in its findings. The Marines created a battalion of 100 female and 300 male volunteers. During the past year, they trained in North Carolina and California, taking part in realistic combat exercises. All male squads, the study found, performed better than mixed gender units across the board. The males were more accurate hitting targets, faster at climbing over obstacles, better at avoiding injuries. The findings were clear, but in a recurring theme for the modern U.S. military, leaders have ignored reality in favor of politically motivated fantasies. This behavior has been clear from the beginning of the Women in Combat project. Reporting by People magazine, of all places, described the travesty of letting women graduate Ranger School in 2015. Quote, way back in January, long before the first women attended the Army's Elite Ranger School, one of the most grueling military courses in the world, officials at the highest levels of the Army had already decided failure was not an option. A woman will graduate Ranger School, a general told shocked subordinates this year, while preparing for the first females to attend a gender-integrated assessment of the grueling combat leadership course. At least one will get through. That directive set the tone for what was to follow. It had a ripple effect at Fort Benning, where Ranger School is based, says a source with knowledge of the events. Even though this was supposed to be just an assessment, everyone knew. The results were planned in advance. Multiple sources told People women were first sent to a special 2-week training in January to get them ready for the school, which didn't start until April the 20th. Once there, they were allowed to repeat the program until they passed, while men were held to a strict pass-fail standard. Afterward, they spent months in a special platoon at Fort Benning getting, among other things, nutritional counseling and full-time training with a ranger. While in the special platoon, they were taken out to the land navigation course, a very tough part of the course that is timed on a regular basis. The men had to see it for the first time when they went to the school. Once in the school, they were allowed to repeat key parts like patrols, while special consideration was not given to the men. A two-star general made personal appearances to cheer them along during one of the most challenging parts of the school, multiple sources tell People, unquote. Militaries cannot operate on fantasy. They must be driven purely by ruthless considerations of effectiveness because the battles they fight are literally life and death. Yet now, the U.S. military is debasing its standards to please feminists and other progressives. This can cause only long-term damage to military effectiveness. In November 2017, a very peculiar event took place in the U.S. military. This is from NBC News. An active duty service member underwent gender transition surgery Tuesday, and the first such procedure approved under a waiver, allowing the Pentagon to pay for the operation. The patient is an infantry soldier who identifies as a woman, according to a source close to the service member. She got her combat infantry badge in Operation Anaconda in Afghanistan in 2003. Vice Admiral Raquel Bono, head of the Defense Health Agency, which provides medical care to active duty personnel, approved the waiver request for the surgery, according to a DoD document. Revolver comments, think about the basic insanity of this scene. The U.S. military paid for the male soldier to have his testicles removed to indulge his delusion that he actually was a woman, and so his body must be cosmetically altered to resemble one. The U.S. military paid tens of thousands of dollars to make a male less able to do the basic physical work of being a soldier. Without testicles and with heavy helping of female hormones, the soldier in question will be less strong, less agile, less able to function as a warrior. Even ignoring the ridiculous decision to fund sex change surgery and long-term hormone treatments by indulging this unnamed soldier, the military is acquiring a person who is overwhelmingly likely to have other mental health issues such as depression and suicidal ideation. No bigotry against the transgendered is needed to see the absurdity here. The military disqualifies otherwise healthy people from service just for having one kidney. The notion that the military should spend millions of dollars to enable this, rather than politely discharging any soldiers who come out as transgender, is indicative of a deeply disturbed mentality within the service. President Trump wisely reimposed the military's old ban on service by transgender soldiers, but less than 1 week into his presidency, Joe Biden reversed the ban, with Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin tweeting, "Our armed forces are at their best when they represent the talents of our entire population, regardless of gender identity." Oh, are we going to see a lot of furries in the U.S. military? Is there potential being adequately tapped? The Army plans to promote based on diversity, not ability. In July 2020, after the death of George Floyd, the DoD Board on Diversity and Inclusion began compiling a report on how to improve diversity in the armed forces. When the board delivered its report in December, Acting Secretary of Defense Christopher Miller immediately accepted all its recommendations. Some of those recommendations were silly but relatively harmless, but other recommendations will dramatically inhibit military effectiveness in the long run. Right now, the military is planning to eliminate all aptitude tests that inhibit diversity. In other words, it is eliminating all tests that racial groups perform differently on. This is a delusional errand because different groups do not perform equally unvalid predictive aptitude tests. The makers of the SAT, GMAT, LSAT, and GRE tests, among others, have spent millions of dollars removing every trace of deliberate bias, yet they continue to show substantial performance gaps between groups. There are other disastrous policies that will be implemented thanks to the Diversities Board report. For instance, to retain minorities beyond initial commitment and into leadership ranks, all service members must have and perceive opportunity for advancement based on skill and capability. The U.S. A policy will be issued to monitor and evaluate the military department's aggregated demographic trends and other contextual data that inform career development processes. In other words, military officers have been ordered to hit diversity quotas or they will have their own careers torpedoed. This is a suicidal command. The United States continues to rely on absolutely ancient weapons platforms. When the A-10 Thunderbolt was introduced as part of the Air Force's arsenal, Star Wars was the #1 movie in America. 43 years later, the Air Force desperately wants to retire it, but is kept alive not due to necessity, but due to politics. Why is Congress so obsessive about keeping alive a plane that the military doesn't want? 7 years ago, the plane was saved by Republican Senator Kelly Ayotte, whose husband flew the plane in Iraq. Twice defeated Senate appointee Martha McSally also flew the plane and played a key role in saving it this time around. The A-10 is far from alone, though. The B-52 bomber is so named because it first flew in 1952. It's still in service right now, and the Pentagon expects to keep it until at least the mid-30s, which means delays will keep it around even longer. The past decades have seen enormous advantages in just about every technological realm related to warfare, computing, artificial intelligence, digital communications, material science, aeronautics, and more. But the vast U.S. military continues to rely on aging technology for a huge array of roles. A few years ago, a friend of mine, a U.S. journalist, told me that his researchers had found that the U.S. military pays more for daycare than the entire military budget of supposed great enemy Iran. Now, the idea that daycare would be a huge expenditure within any military, to me, points to a very serious problem. Revolver continues that America's big advantage in military spending is illusory. One of the main reasons the U.S. military is assumed to be completely dominant globally is simply the sheer size of the U.S. defense budget, about $730 billion last year, greater than the estimated spending of the next 9 countries combined. That's a lot of money, but the advantage it creates is smaller than believed. Nobody in the West actually knows how much China spends on its military, but the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute estimates that China's defense spending has grown from barely $50 billion to more than $260 billion. That's barely 1/3 of what the U.S. spends, but for starters, China is a low-income country, which means it can pay far less in personnel costs for the massive military it fields. And I suspect that Chinese spending on daycare for its troops is nugatory. Enormous firepower masks strategic vacuity. This was made disturbingly clear by the war in Afghanistan, especially from internal documents released in 2019 by the Washington Post. Yes, and Richard Hanania reported U.S. military transported fuel by helicopter delivers pizza and ice cream instead of eating local food. And my favorite, Ambassador Douglas Lute, says that the U.S. government spent $1 million per soldier to get them Burger King and bottled water. They couldn't even spend the money fast enough during the Petraeus surge. Every soldier who served in Afghanistan could be a multimillionaire for the cost of this war. American adversaries have the technology to render its greatest weapons obsolete. Service academies are being debased in the name of diversity and football success. The U.S. Military Academy at West Point, the Naval Academy at Annapolis, and the Air Force Academy at Colorado Springs are charged with a crucial task: train the future leaders of America's armed forces. Naturally, they're supposed to only admit the finest applicants, who are then submitted to a rigorous curriculum with high standards. Well, that was the idea. Now the service academies have other priorities, like winning football games. In 2017, former West Point instructor Robert Heffington published an open letter. Every fall, the superintendent addresses the staff and faculty and lies. He repeatedly states that we are going to have winning sports teams without compromising our standards. And everyone in Robinson Auditorium knows that he is lying, because we routinely admit athletes with ACT scores in the mid-teens across the board. I have personally taught cadets who are borderline illiterate and cannot read simple passages from the assigned textbooks. It is disheartening when the institution's most senior leader openly lies to his own faculty, and they all know it. The Cadet Honor Code has become a laughingstock. Cadets know they will not be separated for violating it, and thus they do so on a daily basis. Moreover, since they refuse to enforce standards on each other and police their own ranks, cadets will rarely find a cadet at an honor hearing, despite overwhelming evidence that a violation has occurred. The rot has only gotten worse since Heffington's letter. Last fall, West Point suffered its largest cheating scandal since the 1970s. Dozens of students were caught cheating on a calculus exam in flagrant violation of the school's honor code. But the honor code standard was tossed after this latest scandal, and the unspoken reason was to protect the school's football team. But hey, the Black Knights went 9-3 this year. That's cool, at least. Let's go back to the chat. All right. Canada has no military threat, says Head McNeck. No, it doesn't. The only possible military threat, as I said, is America. And they're pretty friendly with us. The American military couldn't overthrow Oklahoma if it tried, says Head McNeck. Okay, machines are the cause of all these distortions in the fabric. Look at who they are choosing now as the button pressers and lever pullers. Speaks volumes, says Roulette Cracked. I'd say another problem that the United States military faces is that since the Vietnam War, the U.S. military has not fought a war against a country that was both able to fight back and willing to fight back. To paraphrase Hilaire Belloc, the view of the United States military is that we have total air superiority and they have not. And presumably that will last forever. And John S. says, Revolver doesn't seem to understand that the new technology is mostly overpriced, non-performing shit. Take the F-35 as a case in point. I am going to get to the F-35 in just a minute. Ed McNeck says the A-10 is still an extremely capable killer and tough as nails. Palcasso 88 says China has a bigger navy than the U.S. Hulls, not tonnage. John S. says myth of the 20th century did a 4-hour interview with one of the engineers on the F-35 program. Steve says there's no difference between officers who go through the service academies and officers who get commissioned through ROTC. Well, that's not my understanding. I know Ranger School is notoriously tough, but West Point used to be notoriously tough as well. Metal Mike says, have you been watching CPAC 2020? No, I haven't. I make a point of completely avoiding CPAC because it is normally filled with Conservatism Inc. grifters. Perhaps it's a little different this year. But let's talk briefly about the F-35. It's a story from Daniel Axe at Forbes, February 25th. After 20 years, the F-35 stealth fighter is still stuck in testing. Air Force leaders in early 2021 all but admitted what critics had been saying for many years. The $100 million, is that per plane, F-35 stealth fighter that Lockheed Martin is building for the service is too expensive and unreliable for hard day-to-day use. After 20 years of tortured development, the stealth fighter's problems have gotten so bad that some officials have floated the idea of launching a new program to build a cheaper, more reliable fighter, one that finally might replace the Air Force's roughly 1,000-old F-16s. After all, it is increasingly apparent the F-35 will never be as affordable and flyable as the stalwart F-16. Just how big of a mess is the F-35? Dan Grazier, an analyst with the Project on Government Oversight, closely read the U.S. Defense Department's latest weapons testing report and came to a sobering conclusion. It, quote, remains in every official sense nothing more than a massively expensive prototype, unquote. Well, yes, this question is, what is a military for? Well, one of its purposes, both in Canada and the United States, is to provide big, big money to companies like Lockheed Martin and to the retired generals who sit on the boards of these companies. How much of a why is the F-35 a white elephant? Well, one of the reasons is that these service branches all demanded their own version of the plane. So it became what they call a kludge. So the JSF program was expected to cost about $200 billion in base year 2002 dollars. When the contract was awarded in 2001, as early as 2005, the GAO had identified major program risks in costs and schedules. The costly delays, this is from Wikipedia, strained the relationship between the Pentagon and contractors. By 2017, delays and cost overruns had pushed the F-35 program's expected acquisition costs to $406.5 billion, with a lifetime cost, that's to 2070, to $1.5 trillion, and then your dollars, which also includes operations and maintenance. The obvious question is why did the U.S. military decide to build a next generation stealth fighter that was manned? Why not a drone? The advantages of drones are obvious. You're going to gain, I don't know, somewhere between 150 and 175 pounds because there's no pilot. Also, you don't have to design all of these systems in the aircraft to protect the pilot. But no, I understand that men like to fly planes and people in the Air Force would like to continue to fly planes. But what happens when America's potential adversaries decide to move into drones? Maybe they're moving into them already. So let's move on to a different. Oh, yeah, this is slightly related, and it is too funny. And this comes from NASA. Hey, kiddies, you know that NASA put several men on the moon? Several successful moon landings? It's true. Sounds crazy, but it's true. And this first happened in 1969. This is a tweet from NASA. The trip to Mars can only be understood through Black Americans. That's a direct quotation. Poet and educator Nikki Giovanni reads an excerpt from Quilting the Black IP to today's opening naming of the NASA headquarters building for Mary W. Jackson, our first African-American female engineer. Mary W. Jackson was one of the three featured in the movie Hidden Figures, which is almost completely bogus. Scott Greer responds, this is not a parody account, and apparently NASA now stands for National Affirmative Space Action. Who is Nikki Giovanni? Her Wikipedia entry runs into thousands of words. I've heard about this woman for decades. She is a poet, and her work is absolutely dreadful. Absolutely dreadful. And of course, she is a lesbian. American poetry was pretty much colonized by lesbians beginning, in the 1960s? According to Wikipedia, Giovanni is known for her use of vernacular language. Virginia Fowler, in the introduction of the collected poetry of Nikki Giovanni, states, Giovanni's poetry draws our attention to the limitations and artificiality of language, and of language shaped into what we call art. Fowler quotes the poem My House, in which Giovanni writes, quote, English isn't a good language to expression through, mostly I imagine because people try to speak English instead of trying to speak through it. Deep, deep, deep thought. Giovanni's poetry reaches more readership through her active engagement with live audiences. Yeah, it's just, don't bother. Don't bother looking this up. Apparently, this woman, Audre Lorde, another Black lesbian American poet. Yes, discrimination, discrimination, discrimination. Well, Audre Lorde got locked into the system in the early 60s, and a series of prestigious, high-paying jobs and awards follow, even though I suspect there's no more than 5 or 10,000 people in the United States who have ever read a poem by Audre Lorde, unless, of course, they were forced to in college. Let's say willingly read a poem by Audre Lorde. When I was looking this up, this led me to a woman called Janet Mock, who is a male to female transsexual and a big deal in the entertainment world, apparently. And I found this from 2011. Yesterday, Marie Claire, that's a fashion magazine, gave the alphabet people a breath of fresh air through publishing I Was Born a Boy, which detailed Janet Mock's account of growing up transgenders, which included, yes, bootleg testosterone. Yeah, okay. But Janet Mock was not pleased with Marie Claire's encomium to her. Mock took issue with how the magazine represented her by stating that she was born and raised as a boy. She says she was always a girl. Mock said, I was born in what doctors proclaim is a boy's body. I had no choice in the assignment of my sex at birth. My genital reconstructive surgery did not make me a girl. I was always a girl. In 2014, while promoting her book, Redefining Realness, she reiterated that she did not choose the Marie Claire article title and found it to have many problems. Okay, so she did not choose her gender assignment. Oh, in the same way that she didn't choose her parents or choose the color of her hair or the color of her skin or the color of her eyes or the shape and size of her body or her IQ. I could go on, but no, she didn't choose it. Yeah, well, she later rectified that problem. But again, this leads me to something which has been conveniently elided. For decades, we were instructed that being gay or lesbian is not a choice. How dare you say that? That is outrageous. It is immutable. It is an immutable fact of one's personhood. Not anymore, it isn't, because we hear about non-binary people now and gender fluid people. So apparently one's sexuality and gender not immutable at all. It's completely mutable. One can switch back and forth. One could be a little bit of this, a little bit of that. One can be none of the above. So I guess this really explains why, for instance, apparently lesbianism is disappearing because, apparently that's immutable and that's boring, as opposed to being whatever you feel like on the current day. I mean, being stuck in an immutable category, pretty fascist, isn't it? But don't expect to hear any discussion on why we were told one thing for decades, that one's sexuality, not a choice, immutable. Now we're being told exactly the opposite by the very same people. Okay, let's have a little look at what's going on in Portland from my old friend Dennis Dale. And we're not hearing very much about Portland in the news. I guess what the election's over now, and Antifa is kind of embarrassing to the left. He writes, the Rose City Park neighborhood in Portland's beleaguered East rose in the aspiring rapper Fantasy League rankings, standing now at 653 total offenses. There were multiple victims in a shooting in Northeast Portland Thursday night. The shooting happened near Northeast 66th Avenue and Broadway A large number of police responded to the scene. Another mentally ill white man is looking down the barrel of a bias crime conviction. Yes, apparently the use of a certain word can lead people to spend years in jail. Years in jail. Not a hate crime, a bias crime. Okay, so let's go to a bigger story. Antifa goes to church. In a recent Pottstown police blotter here, I linked to a news item about what appeared to be a demon infestation of a Catholic church. Officials were dispatched to a cathedral in the 1700 block of Northwest Davis Street just before 3:30 a.m. after receiving reports that someone was breaking things and throwing objects through windows from inside the church. Upon their arrival, PPB officers discovered a man holding a box cutter or type razor blade yelling at one of the resident church pastors. The pastor was unable to calm the man down and eventually fled outside to police who had surrounded the building. A K-9 unit helped officers with searching the church, and eventually the suspect tried to escape and was quickly apprehended and arrested. Judging by the nature of the event, Dennis Dale writes, and the booking photo, I took it to be the act of a homeless lunatic, of which we have many. Today, Andy Knows Postmillennial reports the perpetrator had been involved in Antifa violence before, and it was a Catholic church, something local news station KOIN left out, describing the rector there as a pastor, that may have drawn attention for a demonstration described as an exorcism of the city's political violence. Yeah. The PM fills in a bit more left out of the original report. Monsignor Gerald O'Connor said he was awakened by the sound of screaming and was joined by two Portland area clerics who had spent the night at the rectory after losing power at their parish homes due to the heavy snowstorm. He tried to calm the suspect but failed. He met police outside the church. During the height of nightly riots by BLM Antifa in Portland last year, Coletta, this is the fellow who was arrested, took to Facebook to complain that he was hit in the ribs with a rubber munition, they used to call them rubber, police station in southeast Portland, and assaulted police. Coletta was also convicted of felony criminal mischief for an unrelated break-in incident last year. He was given 18 months probation. St. Mary's Cathedral is the seat of the Catholic Archdiocese of Portland. The cathedral's clergy performed the rite of exorcism for the city last year in response to months of riots. I've seen some evidence, Dale writes, Antifa is turning their attention to local churches. One of their number recently tweeted that they should be forcing churches to open their doors during cold weather. Recently, one of the more progressive churches in the area, and that's pretty damn progressive, has boarded up. The First Christian Church, and we can see the rainbow flags, two of them, one on either side of the main door. Oh, and there's rainbows on the walls at the ground level as well. Dale says virtually every church in the downtown area, and we have some lovely old churches, are now thoroughly down with the progressive vision, adorned in rainbow flags or Black Lives Matter propaganda. Will it spare them in the end? Portland District Attorney Mike Schmidt took office early in Portland's summer of rioting. One of his first acts was to drop most charges against rioters. Schmidt was surrounded by 4 black leaders from Portland who were part of his 15-person transition team, a rare display of public collaboration between community members and a Multnomah County District Attorney, especially one just days into his new job. His prosecutors won't pursue demonstrators accused of interfering with police, disorderly conduct, criminal trespass, escape, or harassment if the allegations don't involve deliberate property damage, theft, or force against another person, or threats of force. He's kept his word in prosecuting only the most egregious acts of violence. And then Dennis explains for the first time about this new category of bias crimes. And it turns out that, the city's brand new Portland Street Response Team. Sounds very 60s, kind of like the Mod Squad. Sending 4 social workers with a paramedic to mental health calls. What they mean by mental health calls is generally some lunatic with a weapon, typically a knife, threatening to harm herself or himself or others. And yeah, you don't want people with weapons to deal with that. Send in the social workers. This is from KOIN. During the early days of the 2020 arrest, calls were made for Portland to stop sending armed police officers to deal with mental and behavioral health challengers. And the Portland Street Response Team is the first step towards that goal. Mayor Ted Wheeler, Commissioner Joanne Hardesty, if you really want to fright, do a Google image search on the woman Joanne Hardesty. She's not from Portland, of course. And there is a picture of this response team. And I notice that one is a woman with asymmetrical, short, pink hair. And I would reckon her to be somewhere between 60 to 80 pounds overweight. And I guess we have a new directive that you only get one call to the police. Something rotten in Portland, Dennisdale reports. On February 16th at about 4 p.m., a call came into a grocery store, the 3000 block of Northeast Weidler Street, regarding a group of people arguing with employees and refusing to leave the property. The power was out and employees were discarding spoiled food. People in the crowd took exception to their work. Initially, no officers were available to respond. At about 4:17 p.m., an employee called back because they felt the situation was escalating and feared there might be a physical confrontation. The crowd grew to about 20 people, and the employee calling wanted police to remove the people from store property. At about 4:30, North Precinct officers arrived and gathered information from the store representative. The position of the employees of the store was that the food was spoiled and required to be disposed of due to lack of refrigeration. The food was unfit for consumption or donation. Officers also tried to explain this to the group of people. No subject in the crowd was willing to have an open dialogue with the officers and continued to shout insults at them and store employees. As it was private property, the officers asked the group to leave store property or risk potential arrest. People in the crowd slowly moved away. Officers' interest in this call was to preserve peace, prevent violence, and restore orders. Officers estimated the crowd grew to about 50 people. Between about 5:05 p.m. and 5:15, there were the most officers on scene. Most were there for about 10 minutes. Antifa and most media outlets reported the scene as police guarding a dumpster of food, when in fact they were called by store staff because the mob was threatening employees who had been given that miserable task, trying to keep Antifa scroungers from distributing spoiled food. Apparently in Portland now, you only get one distress call a night if it involves Antifa. Quote, officers left the scene once they believed parties were separated and there was no longer any threat of harm. After officers left, employees called to report people in the crowd moved back onto store property and were confronting employees again. Store employees reported that people in the crowd were making threatening statements to them. Police supervisors decided that unless there was an imminent threat to life or threat of serious injury, police would remain away. Police did not return to the scene. Oh, imminent threat to life. Well, spoiled food can often be a threat to life. And I can envision a situation where people get sick from eating this spoiled food, and then they sue the grocery store, saying the grocery store should have taken efforts to prevent them from getting it. I can absolutely see that happening. Yeah, Portland. Portland is a beautiful city on the West Coast, which is becoming or has become a shithole, just like San Francisco. Who's to blame? How about blaming the people who they elect people like London Breed or Ted Wheeler? Oh, well, I mean, the woman who was running against Ted Wheeler in Portland was even crazier than he is. Is this the best that the people of Portland can come up with? Let's have a look at the chat here. I can't take this anymore. I'm going to the driving range to whack some golf balls, says Roulette Cracked. Ed McNeck says, I started working in Portland a few months ago. All the stories are true. Even in broad daylight, you keep your car doors locked and your head on a swivel. Social worker response teams are better because they can retard any escalation, says Metal Mike. Hikma Warrior says pink hair is a low IQ reveal. I've known some social workers in my life, and it has been my experience that they tend to develop very strong empathy with lawbreakers and with those who abuse children. They end up affected. If you follow their orders, if you take all their courses and you parrot everything they say, they become effectively on the side of the criminals and the child abusers. And I am not making this up, says Roulette Cracked. A man preparing an explosive device in his garage for a gender reveal party blew himself up and killed himself. Yeah, I read about that. Yes, apparently explosives can be dangerous. How many people have been killed by t-shirt cannons? Surely there must be some. Okay, I'm going to be moving to the book club in about half an hour or so. This is from Agence France Presse. Paris eyes 3-week COVID-19 lockdown in bid to then reopen everything. Yeah. Have we heard this story before? Possibly. All over the world? Again and again and again? Well, this lockdown will take care of it once and for all. Oh, and then the lockdown and number of cases goes down, and eventually they end the lockdown. Number of cases goes up. Oh my God, we need more lockdowns. In an interview with French broadcaster France Info, Deputy Mayor Emmanuel Grégoire said that the left-wing run City Hall was considering proposing an independent local lockdown for the French capital to stem the worrying rise of new coronavirus infections there, with the prospect of reopening everything after, including its theaters, cinemas, and restaurants. Grégoire described the current anti-COVID-19 measures imposed by President Emmanuel Macron's centrist government, including the country's 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. curfew, as half measures with bad results, adding that we can't be forced to live in a semi-prison for months. Oh, just make it a total prison for 3 weeks? Imagine describing a 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. curfew as a half measure. Okay. And news from New Zealand, which is under the leadership of sad Muslim lady Jacinda Ardern. This is from the Unity News Network, and it's about tourism in New Zealand. The New Zealand government has been praised for its successful zero COVID strategy, exploiting its island location, small populace, and established biosecurity at points of entry. There is no lockdown, but the country, well, actually, when was this written? Because there was a lockdown in Auckland just a couple of days ago. For foreign tourism is suspended until at least 2022. Plenty of time to save for that dream holiday, but hold your horses, because for New Zealand, the coronavirus has created an opportunity to reset the tourist industry. The strategy is quality over quantity, to radically reduce the number of visitors and to entice the super rich. Appointed as Minister for Tourism, what kind of a country has a Minister for Tourism? After Labour Party won the election last month, Stuart Nash plans to target the global elite instead of grotty backpackers who, quote, pull over to the side of the road and shit in our waterways, unquote. Instead, ideal tourists looking for a piece of paradise will be the type who, quote, hires a helicopter around Franz Josef and eats at a top-end restaurant, unquote. Instead of biodegradable excrement, sightseers will leave a heavy carbon footprint. The sound of noisy speedboats will reverberate around the lake at Queenstown, echoing off the Remarkables mountain range. Simon Upton, Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment, asserts that New Zealand is suffering from over-tourism. Anyone living in Oxford or Cambridge will understand, although the number of tourists in the North and South Islands is hardly overwhelming. Yes, I would think so, seeing as that New Zealand is at the bottom of the world, and it is very expensive to fly there. The new policy will devastate this struggling but significant sector of the Kiwi economy. Catering only for the 1% will lead to thousands of job losses with an adverse impact on society. Not only will outsiders be deterred, so will ordinary New Zealanders. This proudly egalitarian society is becoming more divided by wealth. Ski resorts and nautical leisure pursuits are now too expensive for much of the domestic leisure market. Designated sites of natural beauty and wild habitat will be restricted to rich visitors and a servile workforce. In other words, one could say the system works. In America, this is according to the Washington Post, the wave of COVID bankruptcies has begun. Nearly a year since coronavirus shutdowns began affecting large swaths of the American economy, more businesses are filing for bankruptcy as Chapter 11 filings were up nearly 20% in 2020 compared with the previous year, court records show. Data on a subset of businesses, those registered as corporations, show that some sectors are faring much worse than others, with restaurants, retailers, entertainment companies, real estate firms, and oil and gas ventures filing for protection in far greater numbers than in previous years. Bankruptcies filed by entertainment companies in 2020 nearly quadrupled, and filings nearly tripled for oil and gas companies, doubled for computer and software companies, and were up 50% or more for restaurant owners, real estate companies, and real retailers. And in horrifying news from Britain, this is from reclaimthenet.org, and Ken Macon. Don't forget your passport, the World Economic Forum, and more on them shortly, recently tweeted, promoting the idea of people having to show documentation to enter gyms, restaurants, and bars. One country that likes the sound of that is the United Kingdom. UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson hinted that Brits might require vaccine passports domestically to access public venues such as pubs and theaters. The UK government has previously denied adamantly it was working on the so-called vaccine passports. One thing for certain we know about Boris Johnson, that if he says one thing, he will shortly thereafter say the opposite. In an interview on Sky News, Johnson said that Cabinet Minister Michael Gove was going to lead the government's vaccine passport scheme. Apparently, the government is researching the best scientific, moral, philosophical, and ethical viewpoints on the vaccine passports issue. Gove is one of the government officials that has previously denied that the government would deploy a vaccine passport scheme. Quote, "This is an area where we're looking at a novelty for our country. We've never thought of having anything like this before that you have to show when you have to go to a pub or a theater." Actually, Johnson said that there are deep and complex issues that we need to explore, ethical issues about what the role is for the government in mandating people to have such things, or indeed banning from people doing such a thing. I know the fervent libertarians will object, but other people will think that there is a case for it. Yeah, we have never thought of having anything like this before, Johnson says. That's because no leader of Britain before Boris Johnson would have even entertained the thought of such a thing, thinking that he would be torn limb from limb by an angry citizenry. And let's take a quick look at Lockdown Skeptics today, written by Will Jones. A GP protests no jab, no job. Dr. Claire Jones, who has written to her MP Jesse Norman to protest against being compelled to be vaccinated or face disciplinary action from the General Medical Council. And she said, having worked tirelessly for the NHS for 31 years as a hospital doctor, A&E doctor, and a GP, with probably 2 sick days in my whole career, is the government really suggesting that because I exert my choice not to have the COVID vaccine, my wealth of medical experience is going to be lost just because I choose to exercise my free will and conscience? Like most other people who decline the vaccine, I'm not an anti-vaxxer. My son is fully vaccinated. I have travel vaccines. But I weigh up the pros and cons of vaccines in a more informed way than most people, and have decided for now I don't want it. Likewise, the flu vaccine. There is currently a hemorrhaging of experienced GPs due to unprecedented stress levels, including one over the last couple of months from our 5-partner practice. If I go, it will destabilize our already struggling practice. The government needs to take a break from criticizing the Chinese Communist Party for a moment and stop in its own attempts to re-educate repressive and punitive strategies directed toward minorities, such as those who choose not to be vaccinated. And in England, a great many of those minorities who choose not to be vaccinated are actual racial minorities. Dr. Jones concludes, believe me, I will make the most of an imposed early retirement if enforced vaccination becomes a reality by finishing my thesis on governmental revolving door policies with particular emphasis on pharmaceutical companies. After all, what do I have to lose? Not my freedom. Care UK, one of the UK's largest care home firms, has introduced a no jab, no job policy, saying new staff must have received a COVID vaccination before they start work. The Guardian reports they operate more than 220 private care homes. If you want to read about it, you can go to lockdownskeptics.org and read the entries on how effective are the vaccines. I don't want to discuss that because it would get me into trouble. And you can also look at this handy graph about the lockdown states versus the no lockdown states, and you can look at the proportional number of deaths. And you might find that an eye-opener, because right at the very top are New York and New Jersey, with Massachusetts coming in 4th place. How could such a thing have happened? Okay, I think that's all from that source. And now I'm going to go to Alex Berenson. And again, this very problematic Twitter account, or at least it has become on this live stream. So I must be exceedingly careful. Alex Berenson has a book. He writes, thrilled to announce I will be writing a book on COVID-19 for Regnery to be published later this year. It's called Pandemia, and you can pre-order it now. Ladies and gentlemen, I present Dr. Zoe Hyde. She's an Australian epidemiologist working for Zero COVID. She thinks anal swabs for children will help. Anal swabs for kids. Like we haven't bent them over enough already. I would love to know if Dr. Hyde has children. I'm sure there are exceptions, but as a general rule, never trust a woman called Zoe. And moving on, I'm going to talk about the Machiavellians and leadership. Robert Michels. We must be careful to distinguish the problem of government by the people from that of government for the people. With the latter, Michels' examination is not concerned. The argument has shown that in established organizations of any size, including the state considered as a social organization, government is not by the people. That is, the mass of members does not control the leaders, but the leaders the mass. It may quite possibly be that this is, if not always, at least sometimes best for the people. That is, the interests of the members as a whole and the majority of them individually may be best served by leadership control. This conclusion is maintained by those who defend democracy, but at the same time are willing to recognize that normally the leaders are in charge. They then attempt to reconcile the paradox with democratic doctrine. Michels has written, those professed Democrats who defend the arbitrary acts committed by the democracy point out that the masses have at their disposal means whereby they can react against the violation of their rights. These means consist in the right of controlling and dismissing their leaders. Can the people of the United Kingdom dismiss Boris Johnson as Prime Minister? No, they cannot. And do they have any control over the restrictions on their liberty, on their basic movements instituted by Boris Johnson? No, they have not. In fact, even Parliament is not involved in it. Just executive orders are issued. Burnham comments, this break on the leaders cannot be wholly disregarded, and it would be a mistake to suppose that it is not served to differentiate democratic organizations from those completely subject to an autocratic structure. Mickles, unquestionably, this defense possesses a certain theoretical value, and the authoritarian inclinations of the leaders are in some degree attenuated by these possibilities. In practice, however, the exercise of this theoretical right is interfered with by the working of the whole series of conservative tendencies to which allusion has previously been made, so that the supremacy of the autonomous and sovereign masses is rendered purely illusory. Burnham comments, all those organizational facts that we have been reviewing unite to show that where a definite conflict arises between the leaders and the mass, the odds are overwhelmingly in favor of the leaders. Nevertheless, leaders are sometimes ousted. Does this violate the general principle of the supremacy of leadership? What exactly happens when leaders loses? When there is a struggle between the leaders and the masses, the former are always victorious if only they remain united. The unled masses, less closely organized than the leaders, and perpetually weakened by the whole weight of the organizational pressures, never win against a united leadership. The existing leadership may be overthrown under two circumstances only, and not always under these. I would say, if you look at this with regard to COVID, all of the political parties in the West have said we are all in favor of lockdown. We are all in favor of gross restrictions on basic human activities. It's just a question to what degree. So much for the need of an opposition party to oppose. Burnham elucidates, in the first place, if a division occurs among the leaders, one section or both is forced to seek help from the masses of the membership and is able to organize their strength. The opposition leadership is sometimes successful in eliminating the old leadership. Second, new leaders may and do arise as it were spontaneously out of the masses. If the existing leadership is unable or unwilling to crush or assimilate those outside leaders, then it may be overthrown. In both these cases, however, though the process may appear to take the form of a successful struggle of the masses against their leaders, and thus to prove the supremacy of the masses, in reality it consists only of the substitution of a new leadership for the old. Leadership remains in control. Self-government is as distant as ever. This problem is given more extended and generalized treatment by Pareto, and Burnham says that he shall return to it later. I wish here, however, to remark that Mickles underestimates the indirect, if not direct, democratic significance of the opposition. If it is true that in the end there can be no more than the substitution of one set of leaders for another, nevertheless, through the opposition leadership, the pressure of the masses is brought indirectly to bear upon the leadership as a whole. An opposition, whatever its theories, is compelled to rest to some extent on a democratic basis and to defend democratic practices. The existence of an opposition is the firmest and only firm check on the autocratic tendencies of the leaders. Well, what do we see in Canada? We see that there's no effective opposition. That the Conservative Party says, yes, we agree with everything that the Liberals agree with, only we want it to be done in a more orderly fashion and not so fast, so hard. You see a similar thing in Britain, where there's little difference between the Conservative and Labour parties. And of course, the reason why Donald Trump became a public enemy to the elite is that he made it clear that he had real and significant differences with the Democratic Party and that he intended to legislate on that basis. Burnham writes, there are finally certain tendencies of leadership which, though almost always present to a certain degree, do not get carried in every social organization to their full extreme. These tendencies, however, and especially their extreme development, are so profoundly important for democracy that they deserve a very special notice. In established leaders, there normally occurs what Mickles calls a psychological metamorphosis. In the majority of instances, and above all at the opening of his career, the leader is sincerely convinced of the excellence of the principles he advocates. He has been pushed forward by a clearer vision, by a profounder sentiment, and by a more ardent desire for the general good. He has been inspired by the elasticity and seriousness of his character and by his warm sympathy for his fellows. It is obvious that this will be true above all where the leader does not find already established a solid organization capable of offering remunerative employment, but where his first step must be to found his own party. But this must not be taken to mean that wherever a well-organized party already exists, the leader seeks at the outset to gratify his personal interests. But these qualities do not long resist the habit of power. He who has attained to power will not readily be induced to return to the comparatively obscure position which he formerly occupied. The consciousness of power always produces vanity and an undue belief in personal greatness. In the leader, consciousness of his personal worth and of the need of which the mass feels for guidance combine to induce in his mind a recognition of his own superiority, real or supposed, and awake, in addition, that spirit of command which exists in the germ in every man born of woman. We see from this that every human power seeks to enlarge its prerogatives. He who has acquired power will almost always endeavor to consolidate it and to extend it, to multiply the ramparts which defend his position, and to withdraw himself from the control of the masses. We could consider Joe Biden in this respect. Joe Biden he first entered the United States Senate in 1973. And in 2009, he became vice president. Does Joe Biden have any accomplishments to show? What 4 decades in what is laughingly called public service? No. But the 4 decades that Joe Biden spent in public service persuaded him that he was the only man fit to be president of the United States. I mean, you could see this, getting into petty arguments with people at meetings, boasting of a superior IQ, challenging people to push-up contests, calling people fat or pony soldiers, whatever. That Joe Biden's his years in power had led to a hubris and arrogance such that he was genuinely outraged that anyone would actually dare to question him. And we saw during his leadership campaign, and we have seen since he became president, that he doesn't take questions. No, indeed, he does not. Questioning is for, lesser men, not for the likes of Joe Biden. Okay, so before I move on to the book club, here's a sad story from Canada. As reported by MSN News, a lot of silent suffering. Khadija El-Hilali describes her time at Rideau Hall. Rideau Hall is the residence or the office of the Governor General, who was the titular representative of Queen Elizabeth, the head of state. I've probably mispronounced her name. I don't know why that should be a big issue, because it is not a common name in Canada, but it is a big issue. And this has become a serious issue for the government. A lot of silent suffering. Looking at this woman, hearing her speak and reading her words, I don't think that she does a lot of silent suffering. No, I don't. This is from the CBC. Ex-employee says she left Rideau Hall after reprimand after George Floyd email. Yeah, that well-known Canadian, George Floyd. A former Rideau Hall employee who resigned in June is warning that problems at the institution go well beyond workplace harassment and include an instance of racism that drove her to leave the public service altogether. Such a shame. Khadija El-Hilali says the Rideau Hall workplace is, quote, toxic, unhealthy, and unsafe, unquote, for employees who are Black, Indigenous, or people of color, BIPOC. She said the discrimination she experienced working for the Governor's General office took a toll on her mental health. She sent an email to staffers about George Floyd and was reprimanded for this. She said a white employee was later praised as courageous for raising the same issues at work. The Governor General of Canada, George Floyd. I don't see the connection. I felt ostracized, says El Hilali, who identifies as Afro-Arab. I felt inferior, that I was insignificant. My voice didn't matter because I was racialized. She identifies as Afro-Arab, but apparently she has been racialized. I did feel hurt. I remember crying for what felt like days. Fun woman to be around. I literally didn't sleep for a couple of weeks. No, that's impossible. I kept going through the chain of events over and over again. She said she's sharing her story publicly to urge the next Governor General and future Rideau Hall officials to make racial equality a priority. Okay. There are no specifics. None. None in this story about what she allegedly suffered. None. And I don't expect to hear any either. Obviously, she felt it. There's no question about this, but I got a pretty good idea. I suspect that if people don't talk to her because they're afraid of her, this is an example of discrimination of workplace harassment. If people at work do talk to her, they're demanding her emotional labor for free. Why was this woman hired by Rideau Hall? Here's an earlier CBC story from November 22nd, 2020. Some students and faculty members at universities in Ottawa are calling on administrators to require inclusion and diversity training for all students to help eliminate discrimination, even beyond graduation. When we entered the workforce, we were not prepared. We were not well prepared to face a diverse population, said Carleton University student Khadija El Halali, who wants to incorporate conversations about tackling bias and discrimination into all curriculums, apparently all workplaces as well. In June, she started an online petition calling for mandatory anti-racism course for all degrees at the University of Ottawa and Carleton University. She says that talking about discrimination will help the leaders of tomorrow build more inclusive workplaces. Well, more fractious, certainly. Oh, and here's some more fun intersectional news. And this is, hang on, it's from the Daily Beast. And I'm going to have to open this in a different place. I'm very sorry about that. One of the things that happens with the Daily Beast is it opens the story and then it unopens it. Once again, I'm sorry, give me a sec here. I should have, I apologize for this. I should have remembered. The Daily Beast is a difficult site to go to. Well, I'll tell you what happened. Okay, so a Korean writer for the Washington Post was accused of being a racist because she got involved with criticisms made by a differently racialized person. And everybody is racist now. There's no getting away from it. But in K-pop news, and I know that my viewers and listeners are very much interested in such things, we have intersectionalism raising its ugly head there as well. This is from news18.com. BTS Army are up in arms against a German radio network host after his tweet laden with racist comments against the K-pop band went viral. The tweet contains radio station Bayern 3 presenter Matthias Matuschik's reaction to BTS's recent MTV Unplugged program. It's a very, he did not like the Korean band's cover of Fix You by Coldplay, and he said, for this, you will be spending the next 20 years on vacation in North Korea. Racial humor, absolutely disgusted. Freedom of speech is not so passed for racists to spread their racist propaganda. Your words right here are already a form of violence. Racism is not an opinion. Apparently, it is racist now to say, in the vernacular, your band is shitty. Perhaps South Koreans don't like being reminded of the existence of a country directly to their north called North Korea. Oh, yes. Dress code violations. Media's always loved such stories. And here's one from the CBC from 2 days ago. The father of a high school student in Kamloops, BC, who was sent home for wearing what was deemed an inappropriate outfit, says the incident was absurd and should not have happened. Chris Wilson's daughter, Karis, 17, was wearing a knee-length black dress with lace trim over a full-sleeved white turtleneck. He said her teacher pulled her out of class Tuesday and escorted her to the principal's office because of the outfit. Karis was told that it could possibly make the male student teacher feel awkward, and it could make her female classroom teacher feel awkward since it reminded her of a lingerie outfit. And she took a selfie, Karis did, which I'm looking at. This is not a dress. This is a slip. It's actually a very modest outfit when you look at it. I think the initial comments were based on the fact it had lace. Wilson said the incident felt a little surreal and upset his daughter. Wilson took to social media with his daughter's permission, and his post on Facebook has been viewed over 40,000 times. On Wednesday, Karis's classmates staged a walkout in her support. Oh, yeah. Students love walkouts. It doesn't matter what the cause is. It means we're not in school. That's why they like walkouts. Oh, we could definitely learn some lessons from it, says Mr. Wilson. And apparently, Karis said that she doesn't know what lingerie is. Oh, she doesn't. I don't believe her. I first noticed the existence of a company, basically La Senza. La Senza Girl, it's called. La Senza is a lingerie company. I first noticed this company about 10 years ago, and I thought, they're selling lingerie to children now? Indeed, they are. This is from the Fashion Model Directory. La Senza Girl primarily provides girls between 7 and 14 years age with a comprehensive range of La Senza Girl, which does everything possible to make tween customer and her parents feel comfortable. Yeah. This outlet has been in some controversy that actually the Daily Mail reported about this quite some years ago, that there was a very strong reaction against some of the lingerie items, which were being made for little girls. La Senza Girl. Ah, yes, and here's this girl appears to be 5 years old, and she's got a shirt, sleeveless shirt, that says Drama Queen on it. From 2008, a high street lingerie chain has removed controversial underwear aimed at girls as young as 5 from its website. And here is some thong underwear for 5-year-olds. Why should grown-ups have all the fun? That's the phrase that La Senza used. So the idea that teenage girls don't know what lingerie is, no, I'm not buying it. I suspect that Karis wanted to create a sensation, and she did. And I am going to move on to, well, before I go on to the book club, I am going to have a look at the chat. Okay. Chokokin666 says, I'm convinced social media was created first as a means of social espionage, then as a color revolution engine and tool of intersocial conflict to further anomie. New Huggies baby songs. Was it 15 years ago? Longer than that. I once commissioned a story on diapers for children who shouldn't be wearing diapers. Apparently, it's commonplace now to 4, 5, 6-year-olds to wear diapers. And I see commercials on television for something called pull-ups. I'm a big girl now. Well, if you're a big girl, why are you still wearing diapers? Apparently, it is beyond the wherewithal of parents to toilet train their children. Now, Cecil Henry says, listen, Whitey, I can identify how I want, but you better not notice or act to defend, let alone advance your interests in the country you built. Diversity is the problem, and that. Okay, this is my response to charges of white supremacy. If I'm so white, why aren't I rich? Go ahead and use it, because I think it's pretty good. I think it's pretty good. Lingerie is a baby boomer thing, says Head McNeck. Golly, when I walk through the mall, I see several lingerie stores, and they are advertising to young women, and they are increasingly advertising to, how shall I put it, plus size women. I first noticed this a couple of months ago when I was directly across the street from the Guildford Mall in Surrey, BC, one of the biggest in Canada, where I'd be, walking down the hall, the halls that go on for half a mile, and there would be a big display of women wearing the lingerie, and my eye would be drawn to this, and then whoa, that's a stout lass there. Student walkout. Oh no, not that, says Steve. Media Hit says, wow, Canadians are really SJW. Roosh toured the US a couple of years ago, and his notoriety was already forgotten. Our media is just as SJW as Canadians, but most don't believe this nonsense. Nobody would sit next to her in the lunchroom, says Media Hits. I mean, it's a completely, absurd outfit. I think the reasoning was, I'm going to wear a slip to school, but if I put something under it, then no one will be able to complain. Bring back school uniforms. That's what I say. Jim Bowden says, hi, KMG. My son is a doctor working in Londonistan. He cannot come home to Australia for Christmas. He tells me that 90% of doctors are questioning and are dubious about jab. I'm not allowed to express any opinions on its efficacy. Simply not. Hello to Professor Paul. Zedric, the heretic, says, I watched one episode of Portlandia. The whole episode was about a sexual practice, which I'm not going to mention because it is literally disgusting. Ed McNeck says Ned Flanders' wife was killed by a T-shirt cannon, and they had Ned dating again in the same episode. That was one of the last times that I watched The Simpsons. Hello to our valiant moderator, Chad Chadson. Thank you for your service. Okay. So let's talk about a book which was, I'm going to have to open this, which was published last year. And it's about a disease that first appeared last year. And it's the possible effects on the world of this disease. And I'm not going to mention the title because apparently, well, I'll just put it this way. One of the most powerful and influential men in the world co-wrote, he's the lead author of a book that lists this disease and lists what needs to be done because of it. But use of this phrase is considered a conspiracy theory, and it's considered misinformation, or perhaps worse, disinformation. But I think you know what I'm talking about. The lead co-author is a man called Klaus Schwab. Wikipedia describes him as a German engineer and economist best known as the founder and executive chairman of the World Economic Forum, which is where the elite go to Davos every year to mingle and to plot what their next moves are. And the co-author is a Frenchman. His name is, or he may be Swiss. His name is Thierry Mallet. He is described as the co-founder and principal author of the Monthly Barometer, an analytical and predictive newsletter on macro issues for high-level decision makers. Until 2011, he was senior partner at the Geneva-based IJ Informed Judgment Partners, an investment boutique for ultra-high net worth individuals. Ooh. Prior to that, he was a managing partner at Rainbow Insight, an advisory boutique, which he founded, providing tailor-made intelligence to investors. You get that? Boutique, tailor-made. Ooh, okay. Previously, he had founded and headed the Global Risk Network at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland. So the authors of this book, they are very excited by the Black Plague. Very, very excited by the Black Plague. And the Black Plague, well, it transformed Europe because it killed about 1/3 of the people living there. And feudalism collapsed as a result. But I've written some notes here. And, well, long story short, because of this, disease, which showed up yesterday, there is only one thing that can be done and must be done, and that is globalism. More globalism. Unless we get more globalism, the future of the planet is at stake. This is hilarious to me. They write, outbreaks forced empires to change course, like the Byzantine Empire when struck by the plague of Justinian in 541 to 542, and some even to disappear altogether when Aztec and Inca emperors died with most of their subjects from European germs. The Aztec and Inca empires fell because they were conquered by manifestly superior civilizations. Yeah, it's that simple. Oh, and let's talk about lockdowns. Authoritative measures to attempt to contain epidemics have always been part of the policy arsenal. Thus, there is nothing new about the confinement and lockdowns imposed upon much of the world to manage COVID-19. They've been common practice for centuries. Yes, they have. The confinement, the quarantine of the sick, not the well. Yeah, but no, there's no distinction made here. And yeah, nothing new about that. Oh, the Spanish flu gets mentioned, and I wonder how long it will be before we are told that the Spanish flu was as nothing compared to this disease which showed up last year. The authors write, we so often search for a reassuring mental anchor that can serve as a benchmark when we are forced to ask ourselves tough questions about what will change and to what extent. In doing so, we look for precedents with questions such as, is the disease like the Spanish flu of 1918, estimated to have killed more than 50 million people? Could it look like the Great Depression, which started in 1929? Is there any resemblance with the psychological shock inflicted by 9/11? Could it be like the great financial crisis of 2008, but much bigger? The correct, albeit unwelcome, answer to all of this is no. None fits the reach and pattern of the human suffering and economic destruction caused by the current pandemic. The economic fallout in particular bears no resemblance to any crisis in modern history. As pointed out by many heads of state and government, in the midst of the pandemic, we are at war, but with an enemy that is invisible and, of course, metaphorically. Of course, metaphorically. That's why we take everybody's rights away, and we have curfews We make them wear masks because it's all metaphorically. Yeah. So let's list a bunch of disasters here. COVID-19. Oh, sorry. Worse than all of them. Maybe all of them put together. This is all self-inflicted, of course, but he gets around to justifying that because it's there is no Tina. There is no alternative. And hang on a second here. Point to the next part in the manuscript. Yeah, interdependence. There's a lot about interdependence. Oh, under macro reset. Do all of these think tank people, these Davos people? This is a short book. If you discount the notes, it's about 170 pages. It's exhausting to read because I don't know. It's rather like trying to eat a tomato that you think, oh, this looks juicy and good. And there's just, there's this skin on top and there's just all this stuff like styrofoam inside. It's empty. It's just a bunch of buzzwords. The macro reset will occur in the context of the three prevailing secular factors that shape our world today: interdependence, velocity, and complexity. This trio exerts its force to a lesser or greater degree on us all, whoever or wherever we may be. Compare the writing of the authors here to what you have heard from James Burnham. Clear, concise, full of ideas. Interdependence. If just one word had to distill the essence of the 21st century, it would have to be interdependence. A byproduct of globalization and technological progress, it can essentially be defined as the dynamic of reciprocal dependence among the elements that compose a system. Oh, and there was no interdependence before globalism? Absolute bosh. An interdependent world is a world of deep, systemic connectivity in which all risks affect each other through a web of complex interactions. This is an argument against interconnectivity, interdependence, because, something bad happens halfway around the world and it's going to wreck our countries. You do not want this. This book is it's an argument for even greater scale and fragility. There's a hilarious chart, figure 1, which links everything that climate action failure to extreme weather, to global governance failure, to water crises, to it's all interconnected, and this is the absolutely useless chart. Absolutely useless. The Internet of Things. I like this. Apparently that's a good thing. Yes, the Internet of Things now connects 22 billion devices in real time, ranging from cars to hospital beds, electric grids and water station pumps to kitchen ovens and agricultural irrigation systems. Why would anyone particularly want to be spied on by their stove or refrigerator or by the security unit they have installed in their house or apartment? Why would anyone think that that is a good thing? Because you are being spied on them. Then we get into specifics about this disease which showed up last year. And there's a very serious error promulgated here. For instance, we can't compare this to the flu. Terrible, terrible mistake. Because with the flu, it's just estimates. But with this new disease, there are confirmed cases. Oh, really? Because public health officials in the United States admitted almost from the beginning that, they thought that someone displayed symptoms or someone had been in contact with someone who had this disease. So they were lumped into that figure as well. There's also the question of PCR testing. And what that means with regard to confirmed cases. But lockdowns, yep, it got to last. Well, if not forever, but until, I don't know whether it goes, eliminationist. The authors write this. Throughout the pandemic, there has been a perennial debate about saving lives versus the economy, lives versus livelihoods. This is a false trade-off. No, it is not a false trade-off. They continue from an economic standpoint. The myth of having to choose between public health and a hit to GDP growth can easily be debunked. Can it? There are 6 million traffic accidents in the United States every year. Tens of thousands of people are killed. What if speed limits were reduced to, say, 30 miles an hour everywhere, and in the city, 10 miles an hour? How many lives would that save? It would save thousands and thousands of lives. Is it worth doing it? We allow children to walk around the house. We allow them to stumble on the streets, and they're not wearing helmets. How many lives are lost by this? Well, some lives are lost, and children will suffer, brain injuries, say, from falling down, smacking their heads on the sidewalk. Perhaps we could, require children up to a certain age, 6 or 12, to wear helmets at all times. Of course, there are trade-offs, and it is not a myth. And they continue, leaving aside the not insignificant ethical issue of whether sacrificing some lives to save the economy is a social Darwinian proposition or not. Deciding not to save lives will not improve economic welfare. The reasons are twofold. On the supply side, of prematurely loosening the various restrictions and the rules of social distancing result in an acceleration of infection, which almost all scientists believe it would. Notice they're not talking about death here. Do you notice that? They're talking about infections. And this book acknowledges the extremely advanced age of people who die of this, but is completely incoherent. On the demand side, the argument boils down to the most basic yet fundamental determinant of economic activity, sentiments, because consumer sentiments are what really drive economics. A return to any kind of normal will only happen when and not before confidence returns. Oh, so you put people into a panic situation and then you expect the return of confidence. Do you? There have been panics in Australia and New Zealand where this disease is, in Australia, little more than a nuisance, and in New Zealand, not even that. People eating at restaurants at 9:30 p.m. in Auckland, rushing out in terror when a lockdown order was issued. Does that seem to you to inspire confidence? Not to me. Oh, and we get to, yes, let's see what Imperial College London has to say. Oh, and they've been right about everything, going back decades. Have they? No, actually, it's quite the opposite, but never mind that. Let's see. Oh, economic reset. And as far as I can tell, again, the economic reset, more interdependence, more globalism. The direction of the trend is clear, but ultimately systemic change will come from policymakers and business leaders willing to take advantage of disease stimulus packages to kickstart the nature-positive economy. This will not only be about public investments, the key to crowding private capital into new sources of nature-positive economic value will be to shift key policy levers and public finance incentives as part of a wider economic reset. There is a strong case for acting more forcefully on spatial planning and land use regulations, public finance and subsidy reform, innovation policies that help to drive expansion and deployment, in addition to R&D, blended finance, and better measurement of natural capital as a key economic asset. Well, we have seen in Japan and Korea, to give two examples, that this new mercantilist approach, for instance, the Japanese saying, we are going to build an auto industry and we are not going to obey, notions about free trade. Same thing in Korea. That sort of targeted effort has been shown to work. What the authors are talking about here is just this sort of nebulous, we're going to throw money, borrowed money all over the place, and there will just be some, renaissance. There's absolutely no evidence of this. And nature positive economy, I don't see how increased scale and fragility can possibly be described as nature positive. But this treatise is everything at the same time. Now, the authors cannot be accused of not recognizing from the many problems brought about by lockdowns. When people lose jobs with no state support and no health insurance, they tend to die of despair through suicides, drug overdoses, and alcoholism, as shown and analyzed extensively by Ann Case and Angus Deaton. Economic recessions also provoke deaths outside of the U.S., but policy choices in terms of health insurance and worker protection can ensure that they are considerably fewer. This is ultimately a moral choice about whether to prioritize the qualities of individualism or those that favor the destiny of the community. Yes, and of course, globalism has always been about the destiny of the community. Well, it has been, but we're talking about the world community, aren't we? It is an individual as well as a collective choice that can be expressed through elections, But the example of the pandemic shows that highly individualistic societies are not very good at expressing solidarity. Yes, and capitalism, Leo, and neoliberalism, the capitalism version 2.0, have been all about breaking down solidarity and community. That's the old world. That's the old world. There's a fair amount in this book about mental health. And I have to say, the fact that the world that we live in is crazy, that we've decided we don't need community, we don't need families anymore, we don't need nations anymore, we don't need traditions anymore, we don't need religion anymore. Could that have something to do with the skyrocketing rates of mental illness? Or could the fact that the media and drug companies continually tell us that mental illness must be destigmatized, that in fact for younger people, a great many young people, and you can see this by going to Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, mental illness is considered to be a badge of honor. Let's see, mental health, the most significant single factor affecting people's level of satisfaction with their lives, was already on the radar screen of policymakers in the post-pandemic era. These issues may now be given the priority they deserve. This indeed would constitute a vital reset. Oh, and we get into the absurd here that let's look at the silver lining of this disease. Creativity. It may be a cliche to say that what doesn't kill us makes us stronger, but Friedrich Nietzsche had a point. Not everybody who survives a pandemic emerges from it stronger, far from it. However, a few individuals do, with actions and achievements that may sound marginal at the time, but with hindsight are seen to have made a tremendous impact. Being creatively minded helps. So does being in the right place, like the right industry at the right time. There is little doubt, for example, that in the next few years we will witness an explosion of creativity among startups and new ventures in the digital and biotechnological spaces. Really? There's no doubt? Let's see, since the World Wide Web was created in 1995, and let's look at the introduction of the smartphone. What we've seen in terms of advantages are, your smartphone gets marginally better, and then it gets marginally better, then marginally better, maybe. And look at all the apps. Seems to me there's been very little in genuine innovation, which is particularly useful in terms of economic productivity. in this area since what, the 1990s. The most gifted entrepreneurs will have a field day. The same may well happen in the realms of science and the arts. Illustrious past episodes corroborate that creative characters thrive in lockdown. Isaac Newton, for one, flourished during the plague when Cambridge University had to shut down in the summer of 1665. After an outbreak, Newton went back to his family home in Lincolnshire, where he stayed for more than a year. During this period of forced isolation, described as an annus mirabilis, he had an outpouring of creative energy that formed the foundation for his theories of gravity and optics, and in particular, the development of an inverse square law of gravitation. Okay. I will point out that science was not owned by the state during the days of Isaac Newton. It is owned by the state now, as we see with the official reactions, scientific reactions to this disease I've been talking about. The science is settled. Oh, it is. How old is this disease? And don't you keep telling us that we don't know very much about it, but science is settled? No. Oh, a similar principle of creativity under duress applies to literature and is the origin of some of the most famous literary works in the Western world. Scholars argue that the closure of theaters in London forced by the plague of 1593 helped Shakespeare turn to poetry. Yeah. Okay. We don't care about art anymore. We don't. I mean, Bonner Shakespeare could appear, and you know what? What happened if he appeared? He'd be asked to, I don't know, help write a Marvel movie, some cape shit, because that's the stuff that people care about now. Oh, the importance of nature. Imagine globalists talking about the importance of nature. Hang on. Yes. The way forward may be inspired by the example of Japan, together with a few other countries. Today, the positive value of minimalism, made viral by the Marie Kondo series. Oh, please. The lifelong pursuit of finding meaning and purpose in life, and the importance of nature and the practice of forest bathing are being emulated in many parts of the world. Yes, the Japanese have stopped having children. They've stopped having sex, apparently. Even the younger people. You may have read about that recently. Having sexual intercourse and producing children, you can't get more natural than that. But let's go to a part that gets to the heart of it in the conclusion. Oh, there's so many quotations from so many different sources. It's like a George Will column. Look at how clever we are. Did they have a quote boy working for them? I wonder. To avoid such a fate, the one described in Gabriel Garcia Marquez's Chronicle of a Death Foretold, without delay, we need to set in motion the Great Reset. This is not a nice to have, but an absolute necessity. Failing to address and fix the deep-rooted ills of our societies and economies could heighten the risk that, as throughout history, ultimately a reset will be imposed by violent shocks, like conflicts and even revolutions. It is incumbent upon us to take the bull by the horns. The pandemic gives us this chance. It represents a rare but narrow window of opportunity to reflect, reimagine, and reset our world. Oh, and there's the obligatory mention of George Floyd. And you can't write anything now or talk about anything now without mentioning this most important man. The tragic death of George Floyd, no, it was not tragic in any sense. An African-American killed by a police officer in May 2020 vividly illustrates this point. It was the first domino or the last straw that marked a momentous tipping point at which an accumulated and profound sentiment of unfairness felt by the U.S. African-American community finally exploded into massive protests. Would pointing out to them that on average their lot is better today than in the past have appeased their anger? Of course not. What matters to African Americans is their situation today, not how much their situation has improved compared to 150 years ago or even 50 years ago. Okay. The material condition of African Americans is obviously much better than 150 years ago or even 50 years ago, but then there is the mental condition. As recently as 50 years ago, the elite of Black America, they consider themselves to be Americans. They do not consider themselves to be Americans today. 50 years ago, despite grievances that Blacks and Black leaders had against white Americans, apart from exceptions, say the Black Panthers, Black Americans did not believe, as LeBron James does, that every time a Black American leaves his or her home, he is worried that he is going to be hunted down by white people. This is evidence of a profound decline, a decadence within a civilization. And of course, the media and the elite, for their own reasons, have been pushing this as hard as they can. But to wrap up here, what are the biggest threats to the world? Jared Diamond, the author of Upheaval, How Nations Cope with Crisis and Change, is of a similar opinion, hoping that this disease crisis will compel us to address 4 existential risks that we collectively face. 1, nuclear threats. Do you know that the atomic scientists, that their doomsday clock, is currently set at 11:58 p.m.? This is later in the day than during the Cuban Missile Crisis or the Berlin crisis. Number 2, climate change. Yes, apparently it might get a little warmer some decades from now. Yeah, I can see how that's an existential threat. The unsustainable use of essential resources like forests, seafood, topsoil, and freshwater, and for the consequences of the enormous differences in standards of living between the world's people. Okay, enormous difference in standards of living between the world's people. Yes, that exists. How is that an existential threat? Is the world going to be overrun by enraged people from the Congo, say? No, that's clearly nonsense. And here's the paration. We are now at a crossroads. Our path will take us to a better world, more inclusive, more equitable, and more respectful of Mother Nature. The other will take us to a world that resembles the one we just left behind, but worse and constantly dogged by nasty surprises. We must therefore get it right. The looming challenges could be more consequential than we have had until now chosen to imagine, but our capacity to reset could also be greater than we had previously dared to hope. Mother Nature. Doesn't everyone love Mother Nature? Yeah, bigger in every respect. This is what globalism has been teaching us. This is what neoliberalism has been teaching us. And no, this is not very good for Mother Nature, not at all. As Edward Abbey famously said, growth for the sake of growth is the ideology of the cancer cell. So those are my thoughts on this book by the co-founder of the World Economic Forum and a Frenchman, which uses a phrase which is a real thing. I mean, Joe Biden said it, and Justin Trudeau has said it, and Prince Charles have said it, but we're not allowed to say it. It's an in-group, out-group thing. Ed McNeck says, if being shot while unarmed by the police was his only cause of death, the average Black man would live 3 million years. Jogokin 66 says, Glorious Niponsu. Okay. Fate is systemically consequentialist, says Brandon Smith. A lot of Japanese Zen masters were very wary of the small hats in World War II. Okay. Media Hit said, would it not be fate that a man high on fentanyl went to prison for beating and robbing a pregnant woman, worked with pimps and drug dealers, was killed on the streets. George Floyd's death wasn't tragic. His life was, says Head McNeck. Gandalf White, too, says overly urbanized industrial societies have cities which basically cause ovaries to dry up. And as Coach Greg Adams would say, a lot of baloney pony to just shoot sperm around. Well, this growth that the globalists want, we can see the results in, say, Vancouver or even Victoria. Vancouver is increasingly coming to resemble Hong Kong. Norman Mailer wrote that famous essay, back in the 60s, about people living a mile high in the sky. He seemed to think that this was a good thing. Perhaps he was putting us on. We know, there have been studies on this, that you don't want people living 70 feet above the ground or more, because it induces a kind of psychosis in them, where their mind tells them that, no, this is thick glass. I'm perfectly safe. But they stare out into a void, and their lizard brain says, I'm going to die. So stacking people in the sky is not a good idea for all sorts of reasons. It's difficult to build community when you have people stacked in the sky. But no, that's our future, because our populations have to be made bigger and bigger and bigger, not through natural growth, but through immigration. And these people all have to live somewhere. So Vancouver is now, there's not very many views left in Vancouver because of all the 30, 40, 50 story buildings, many of them condos. But this is what globalism hath wrought. Read Ballard's High Rise, says Chogokin 666. And that will be the final comment of the day and this week. So what is coming up next week on the show? This is delayed by a week, but on March the 1st, St. David's Day, I'll be talking about Edward Elgar and the Renaissance of English music. And on the book club next week, I'm going to be talking about Helen Andrews' controversial new book, Boomers. Well, no, it's not all that controversial because everyone hates boomers and boomers are beaten up in this book, but I'm sure it will be entertaining. I quite like Helen Andrews as a writer and a thinker. And on Theater Thursday next week, I will be talking about Michelangelo Antonioni's Blow Up. So that's it for today and this week. I'll be back on the air Monday at 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern. If you like the show or any part of it, I would greatly appreciate it if you click on the like button and subscribe to my YouTube channel if you have not done so already. If you would like to make a contribution to this live stream, which I could really use at this time, my PayPal account is linked to Kevin_Grace@hotmail.com. Once again, Kevin_Grace@hotmail.com. If you are in Canada, a donation to this live stream can be made directly via Interac at kevingrace@shaw.ca. And as always, I leave you with this. In these days of social atomization and civilizational collapse, I do dearly wish that you, my dear viewers and listeners, manage to forge a genuine human connection in order to ease the burden. Good night.